This wooden engraving has made the rounds in so many places, the chances are pretty high you've seen it before. The first publication with this engraving comes from the book Popular Astronomy, written by the French philosopher and professional astronomer Camille Flammarion, from which the engraving derives its name. It may very well be an original art piece of Flammarion's, as he was known for including dozens if not hundreds of his own beautiful sketches in his books. And like the man piercing through the firmament in this image, we will find that the genius to whom we owe the image was no less a character breaking through the perceived boundaries of the world in his day. Born in Montigny-le-Raz, France in 1842, Camille Flammarion, as a young man, depicts himself as a restless, searching spirit. In his autobiography, which exists only in French, he says that as far back as he remembers, he found himself studying, working, and searching, without ever identifying any material goal. For, quote, "the sole pleasure of knowing has always been the dominant passion of my mind." He knew how to read at 4, write at 4.5, and by the time he was 6, he was the strongest student in his classes. At 7 years old, he questioned philosophical subjects and was convinced that, quote, "death did not exist," and was possessed by a strong attraction to nature and the stars, and deemed the violence of mankind as a disgusting flaw. Early on in his studies, he took it for granted that belief in spirits and the soul was universal across the world's religions. When he was 15 years old, he wrote a book called A Universal Cosmology on 500 handwritten pages, with numerous illustrations from his own hand. This book was also the subject of a lecture he gave around this time. This presaged his eventual writing of over 50 books, wherein he developed his philosophy of cosmic unity and the idea of the plurality of lives of the same soul across the cosmos, and so much more. He dismissed race-based intellectual prejudice and regarded rigid dogmatism and denialist materialism as devastating setbacks to scientific exploration. He also found himself reading the work of Allan Kardec, the founder of Spiritism, at the early age of 15, and had by this time devoured many lectures on astronomy and had clearly read a great deal on the subject. It was around this time that he entered the Paris Observatory per the request of a doctor helping him when he was sick. This led him to learning under the wings of Mr. Leverrier, who discovered for his part an anomaly of Uranus while observing the planet. Wearing a top hat, gloves, cane, and a black suit at 16 years old, Flammarion was a blossoming eccentric who lived far outside of the paradigm of his colleagues, and pursued the truth according to the dictates of his internal calling. But no scientific subject interested him so much as astronomy. He describes his early observational experience as, quote, "flying across the ethereal plains," saying he rarely ever experienced the emotions that he had when working in Mr. Leverrier's office. At 20 years old, Flammarion wrote his first book called The Plurality of Inhabited Worlds, in which he argues that the universe is teeming with life in an unimaginable variety, with extraterrestrials both resembling humans and being so far removed from the human type that we could never comprehend them. By this time, he had already been accepted into the Parisian Society of Spiritist Studies and had met Allan Kardec personally. At 23 years old, Flammarion wrote the book Unknown Natural Forces in 1865 and published this under the pseudonym Hermes. This is his first known work that specifically deals with spiritualism and psychic phenomena, which would be primary subjects of interest for the rest of his life. But when he published this, he made enemies with all of the astronomers in the observatory and was fired. He would later remark in 1910, however, that all those colleagues who disagreed with him at the time now agreed. In this way, we detect Flammarion's role as a frontrunner, which he still is in many respects. Though there is so much to explore regarding his life, for our task we must plunge straight away not into his astronomical works, but into his esoteric writings and his unique approach to spiritualism, which he believed existed well prior to religion and could be studied independent of any religious framework. Flammarion himself took part in many seances throughout his life, but never hesitated to identify actual fraud when he detected it going on. This set him apart from easy believers, for he could point out where things were plainly not caused by unknown spiritual phenomena, and then identify where anomalies truly existed, giving them all the full energy of his scientific mind. He recalls from these sessions with Allan Kardec and others how tables lifted into the air were rapped and struck without apparent cause. There were also voices and dictations on subjects and automatic writings. For several years, he followed all these experiences with the greatest interest. And in the French brochures he wrote of these experiences, he reveals that he too was an acting medium in some of these sessions. I want to stress that point because it is not out of the question that he believed a number of his fictional writings were inspired by similar phenomena, though he often took pains to point out that he did not know the material really came from the sources he was told of. The French scholar Charles Kempf found Flammarion's own French communications of automatic writings while Flammarion was active in the Spiritist Society. In 1889, when Flammarion was 47 years old, he published a fictional work, Urania, a patchwork of fiction and possibly personal reports, which follow a young astronomer, much like the young Flammarion, who has a burning desire for the truth and has an experience of being lifted into the heavens by a spirit guide and shown many mysteries of the cosmos. With this quasi-fictional setting, Flammarion allows himself to develop his philosophy without the usual scientific constraints, and the results are nothing less than beautiful. The young protagonist in the story is lifted up and away from the Earth by Urania, his muse of astronomy. He is taken to another solar system with 3 suns, and he witnesses life of an infinite, wondrous variety. In the text, he wisely remarks, quote, "Nothing is so difficult to understand as that of which one is ignorant, nothing more simple than what one knows. Besides, thinkers alone could appreciate the grandeur of these marvels. The vulgar are surprised at nothing. If some new discovery tomorrow should enable us to make signals to the inhabitants of Mars and receive replies from them, 3/4 of mankind would think nothing of it the day after." He no doubt infuses this book with his own experiences, and in the chapter titled Telepathy, he recalls thoughtlessly opening a volume of Cicero and reading a story in which a man is shown a dream where his friend warns the dreaming man of his impending assassination. But the dreaming man sleeps on, only to be confronted later in the night by the same friend's specter, the friend telling him he can find his body in a cart of manure the next day heading into the city. And so the next day, the man wakes, stops the cart from entering the city, and finds his friend's corpse just as forewarned. Flammarion retells the story of King James coming into England during the London Plague, who saw in a dream his eldest son with a bleeding cross on his forehead. The next morning, the king receives a letter from his wife telling him his son had died from the plague. These stories, we will see, are not limited by place, time, or culture, however much sectarians and specialists, denialists and rationalists seek to distract from the mystery. The premonitory dreams of human beings existed everywhere there are human beings, no matter what cultural context they grew up in. Indeed, Flammarion was of the non-sectarian universalist type himself, who saw spirit phenomena as a timeless reality that transcended languages, religions, and cultures. In his book, The Unknown, Flammarion wholeheartedly rejects the arrogant notion that the universal and timeless experiences of non-physical phenomena can be dismissed on any scientific grounds. He argues that this study, instead of being a regression into Middle Age occultism, was a way to put scientists immediately in touch with the unknown. in order to make real progress related to uncovering mysteries of reality. He sees the reverence of the memory of the dead, the immortal wonder we feel when we look at the heavens, and the belief in the soul, or the individual entity that survives the destruction of the body, as universal and constant aspirations of humans across time. Flammarion has little patience for those who fail to seek the truth or never discover the excitement of the mystery, for this is, quote, the mode of reasoning adopted by those who do not care to think for themselves and who confide to directors, so-called, the charge of controlling their consciences. His attitude can be found in the following, quote, poor human beings, so ignorant of most things, whose time passes for the most part so stupidly here, have in their ranks persons who take themselves very seriously and pass judgment. There is but one thing to be done when one takes up any question, and that is not to concern ourselves with such individuals, to disregard their opinions, whether private or public, and to go straight forward in our search for truth. And time again, Flammarion reasserts the independence of his thinking, joining no religion or dogma or even Freemasonry, but seeing in his work only the seeking of truth. The general corner of conclusion which Flammarion could be backed into, however, was that the following stories, quote, tend to show that the soul exists and that our hopes of immortality are not chimeras. In The Unknown, Flammarion analyzes a wide variety of phenomenal cases. He cautiously disclaims their status as unscientific and takes pains to orient them in every way but conclusive, while nonetheless emphasizing their value. Even those he counts as hallucinatory, he still doesn't claim these hallucinations were not experienced or not valuable to science. He counted, like many universal thinkers, on posterity to advance this research. Quote, future ages will develop the seed. We seek to know whether we can arrive at the affirmation that the mysterious phenomena which seem to have been known in the world from its very highest antiquity really exist, and our sole object is to discover the truth. After Flammarion put out his request in magazines and newspapers for personal stories of phenomena, of the 1,824 affirmative letters he received, 786 contained experiences that met the criteria of his questions, and these were only the beginning. The variety of reports he collected around 1899 fit with one or more of the following classifications: manifestations from and apparitions of the dying, manifestations from and apparitions of living persons not ill, manifestations and apparitions of the dead, sight of things taking place far off, premonitory dreams, foresight of the future, dreams showing the dead, meetings foreseen by some inspiration, presentiments realized, doubles of persons living, movement of inanimate things without apparent cause, communications of thought at a distance, impressions felt by animals, cries heard from a great distance, bolted doors opening of themselves, haunted houses, experiments in spiritualism. To Flammarion, it was only natural that people have the tendency to be left behind when the light of brilliant new knowledge shines and moves against the deep-seated dogmas of the time. This was hardly the first time new information smacked brutally against a false paradigm. For what was unknown yesterday is tomorrow the obvious truth. Such it will be regarding the existence of the soul. He points out that the first steamboats sailed badly, whereas in his day they are widely used. That man once thought the earth did not move and that all things could be reduced to the 4 or 5 elements. That the earth was flat, that all miracles outside of Jesus were foolishly deemed the works of Satan, and so on. He argues that the sensed world for the human being exists on only but the most atomically minute sliver of all the frequencies that scientists know to exist, a vibrational spectrum with an extraordinary range far beyond what we can see and hear. And so, in many of the following tales, Flammarion saw the universal spiritual experiences of mankind unsurprisingly at work again. In the first place, he presents reports of telepathic and physical manifestations from the dying or dead. From his friend, a general, he received a story of a breakfast party gathering at the house of a sportsman who had gone out hunting earlier in the morning. Since the hunter hadn't returned, his wife and the guests sit down and begin their meals. It was a calm and windless day when all of a sudden, the window of the dining room, which was wide open, was shut violently with a great noise, and opened wide again immediately. The guests were surprised, astonished that this could have happened without overturning a decanter of water which was standing on a table close to the window, but the decanter remained undisturbed. Those who had seen it and heard the noise could not understand anything of what had occurred. "Something dreadful has happened," cried the lady of the house, rising from the table. The breakfast was suspended. 3/4 of an hour later, the dead body of the sportsman was brought in on a stretcher. In another instance, Mr. and Miss Parmentier were woken up by their bed violently shaking. Again it shook and they scoured the house but found no source of the disturbance. Madame Parmentier grew frightened and thought something bad must have happened to one of her friends, and soon after she heard that her old governess, whom she had not seen since her marriage and who had gone back to Vienna to her family in Austria, had died that same night, and before she died she had several times expressed regret that she had been separated from her dear pupil, for whom she had a warm attachment. Another story relates of a traveling mother and son to Rome. The son had work to do, and so the mother roamed about the city. One day she rushes up to the son in great excitement, telling him she had seen her nephew standing right beside her while she was dressing, and the nephew said, laughing, "Yes, indeed, I am quite dead." The son tried to calm her down, and when they traveled back to France 2 weeks later, they discovered that the nephew had died on the same day and in the same hour as the mother's perceived sighting of him. Flammarion remarks about the nephew's apparent laughter, quote, "May not the psychic force of the dying lad have manifested itself without losing its boyish character?" One man in Texas recalled when he was smoking a pipe and in a relaxed state after a meal, having a vision of his grandfather smiling on his rocking chair and then floating into purple sunlight. The smoking man in Texas awoke as if from a dream, learning 6 weeks later that his grandfather had died on the very day of the vision, between 1 and 2 in the morning in Belgium, which corresponded to the sun setting in Texas at the same time he had the vision. One medical student recalled being in bed when his door suddenly opened, with dragging footsteps coming up to his bed. He hears a sigh and sees nothing, hearing the footsteps recede and go up the stairs. At once he makes a note of the time and perceives the footsteps to be his grandmother's, who he later learns died in the same hour as his experience. On and on the stories go. One woman walks into her cellar and sees a vision of a sandy battlefield, sees one of her cousins, who was in the Crimean War in 1855, dying on a beach. She was overwhelmed with questions by her family, who laughed at her for what she was apparently seeing. And yet, in 2 weeks, they learned that the cousin had died on the very same day as the vision. An extremely noteworthy story came from a writer, Clovis, who was given a prison sentence for writing a controversial article. He shared prison with one Gaston Crémieux, who was condemned to death. One day, discussion arose about God and immortality, and there were many atheists present. Clovis tried to change the subject so as not to disturb Gaston, who was soon to be executed. Gaston told him afterwards, "I thank you, my friend, and when they shoot me, I will come to your cell and give you proof of immortality." And so in the morning of November 30th, Clovis was awakened by a series of little taps on his table. He rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but the taps came on again. He jumped out of bed and stared at the table, hearing the noise again. Per his morning routine, he went to have coffee with Gaston, but the man wasn't in his cell. Indeed, he was told Gaston had been shot to death that morning. Clovis, stunned, was cautious not to tell anyone, and the one prisoner he did tell said that the grief had made him crazy. only the taps happened before he knew Gaston was dead. Clovis writes adamantly in his letter to Flammarion that this is the naked truth. We should note that many of these letters are written by people of all classes and professions, from the most respected scientists to the most unknown laborers. One savant and doctor of science, Mr. Burgay, wrote of his mother's childhood friend, a blind girl, Amélie, who often sang with his mother. Life took the girls in separate directions, and one day Mr. Burgay's mother went out to look for something when she ran back to her salon crying and fell down. "Amélie is dying, she's dead," she cried, for she had just heard Amélie's singing voice, even though they were separated by hundreds of miles. There were many witnesses to this, all of whom were astonished to learn that Amélie had died on the same hour as the incident of the singing voice. One Madame Fonvieille claims to have seen an apparition of an old family friend who told her he was dying now and to forgive him. This happened at midnight. The next day, by telegram, she learns the man had died at 11:45 that same night. This is like the story of the manservant who believed in neither God nor devil, but whom saw his mother standing in his threshold, reaching out for him, who then disappeared. The manservant wept to his employer, proclaiming that his mother had died, which had in fact happened in Paris during the same hour as the apparition. These stories are intensely human and personal. Dismissal in all of these cases is easy, but from the experiencers there is a profound sense of knowing, regardless of what any denialist might say. Mothers who know when their sons are dying, lovers who see their spouses and hear their voices after they die on the same hour, a continent away. One recently married woman found herself in England, whose British husband was an officer in the army in India. At the seaside house of her father, she saw her husband in the garden and rushed out crying his name, "Harry, Harry," but there was no Harry. She looked everywhere frantically, behind the bushes and around the house, nothing. Her friends followed her and tried to calm her down, but she insisted that she saw him. It came as no surprise that her husband had died on the same day and hour as her vision. One story is told of a man and his son seeing a restaurant owner walk the street in broad daylight, even though he was dying in a bed not a far walk away. They both hurried back to the place of the man in bed, only to learn he had died 5 minutes earlier, exactly when they saw him walking the street. Of interest to researchers of light phenomena and UAP, one story from 1885 recounts a blacksmith who was awakened by a light which, quote, "flashed before my eyes. I looked up and saw at the foot of my bed on my left hand a shining disk whose light, not very bright, resembled that of a night lamp. Without seeing any figure, without hearing any noise, there came into my mind the persuasion that I had before me one of my cousins who lived at Langdon, who was very ill. After a few seconds, the vision disappeared and I found myself sitting on my bed." He immediately calls himself a simpleton and proclaims it was only a nightmare. The next day, he received a dispatch with news of his cousin's death in the same hour as the light appeared. It is often reported that those who encounter these phenomena will doubt themselves and write off the events as hallucinations or symptoms of an unknown malady. But when there are other witnesses, it becomes much harder to be convinced of self-delusion. Fathers and sons both being in a house where a door opens after it has been bolted shut, with no one seen entering. Family members gathered around a campfire during a story, where at the climax of the tale a great orb of light appears floating over the scene. It is rather easy to scoff at these anomalies, right up until you are the experiencer reporting what you have witnessed. There are many reports of aromas being sensed at a distance related to dying people, a cologne sprinkled on a dying person whose child smells it miles away. It is evident that there is some overlap with the dream space and the waking world. In one instance, 3 sisters are sleeping in a bedroom. One of them wakes up and sees a shadowy but distinguishable form of their deceased mother leaning down and kissing one of the sisters. That sister wakes up to say that she had a dream of their mother being in the room and kissing her cheek. This is the same event experienced by one sister as a ghostly form of the mother, and by the other through a dream. In one report, a factory owner is visited by one of his employees in a dream. The employee barges into the dream and repeatedly says he's not guilty of what he is accused of doing. The owner wakes up and returns to work to learn that this same employee had died from drinking a poisonous substance. People had already ruled the death a suicide, but considering what the employee said to the owner in the dream, upon further investigation it was discovered that the poison was consumed by accident, for the employee thought he was drinking whiskey. Now we come to visible phenomena that aren't exclusively shadowy and ghostly, but luminous to varying degrees. In one case, a man and his father were in their house, and the father receives news of a dear friend's death, a friend named Cagne. That night, or one night later, they are both in bed, and the son writes, "Suddenly I saw a glow which made me utter a cry of terror. The glow persisted. It was a sort of phosphorescent cloud with definite outlines. It is noteworthy that I had been struck by the glow, though my back was turned and no mirror could have reflected anything." My father pronounced these words in a loud voice. "If you are Cagne, strike 3 blows on the chest of drawers." This was followed by 3 strong blows on the chest of drawers. Then, little by little, the glow thinned, melted, and I saw nothing more. The writer of this report includes this interesting note at the end, quote, "People have often said in my presence, 'After death there is nothing more.' Yes, I always answer, there is something. 'What do you know about it?' they ask. I answer, I saw without wishing to see. I heard, shuddering with fear." Flammarion helpfully includes a synopsis of other light phenomena associated with these sightings, which should allow us to expand the possibilities associated with lights, in that we should not reduce them merely to the trendy phenomena of our time, namely UAP orbs or some such, but we should reserve our conclusions in the face of the variety of light phenomena which are also associated with spiritual apparitions. Flammarion writes, "My readers are familiar with other similar examples, for instance, a glow lighting a room, coinciding with a death, the luminous phosphorescent spot synchronizing with a comatose condition preceding a father's demise, the luminous aureole surrounding someone dead, an apparition enveloped in a very bright light." Among other reports, I'm reminded of the English traveler to New England, John Josselyn, who wrote in 1674 of the Indians of coastal Maine that, quote, "They have a remarkable observation of a flame that appears before the death of an Indian or English upon their wigwams in the dead of night. The first time that I did see it, I was called out by some of them, about 12 of the clock, it being a very dark night. I perceived it plainly mounting the air over our church." There are an overwhelming quantity of light phenomena reported across the world regardless of the epoch and the culture. As Flammarion puts it, quote, "Every observer is convinced of what he had seen, as a mason is sure that the walls he had built were constructed of stones, and a planter is sure that his fields have yielded him grain." The sheer volume of Flammarion's collected reports, mostly isolated to his time and region, clues us into how much people really see, but have little to nowhere to give their reports due in part to the spiritual retardation of the masses, the fundamentalist dogmas of sectarians, and the misfortunate arrogance of authoritative and self-presumed gatekeepers of truth. You will surprise yourself, however, if you begin to ask people around you if they have ever seen any strange lights, had premonitory dreams, heard voices, seen human-like shadows. Flammarion not only wrote The Unknown, packed with reports, but in his 3 volumes of Death and Its Mysteries, he brings a polished sledgehammer to the fragile fortress of scientific materialism and all but bashes it down to the foundation stones, not with conclusions, but with the undeniable deluge of spiritual mystery. the chances are that if we have to deny the most profound experiences in our lives just to keep in good standing with the apparent custodians of the truth, who dismiss most of what doesn't comport with their worldview, we probably should never assume we are acting scientifically, and in fact we have resorted to the same closed mindset of the lamentable religious fanatics and doubters across time. But it should come as no surprise to the researcher in this field how unanimous the voice of collective humanity is on the declaration of the existence of spirits. In the running for the most mystical book of Flammarion's is Lumen, structured as 5 conversations between Quarins, a person living on Earth, and Lumen, a spirit who had recently been incarnate on the Earth. In these conversations, we have a disembodied spirit teaching an inquirer about life beyond the flesh, extraterrestrial planets, the simultaneity of multiple incarnations, and, generally, the proper methods of a harmonious life for the spiritual seeker. If there is ever a work of Flammarion's which we could argue is the direct result of mediumistic or automatic writing, Lumen would be it, although it would be too rash to draw this conclusion based on the evidence we have. The spirit Lumen teaches the inquirer the following, quote, "We are born into the heavenly life, as unconsciously as we were born into the earthly. Only the soul, no longer enveloped by its bodily covering, acquires more rapidly the consciousness of its individuality and of its powers. This faculty of perception varies essentially between one soul and another. There are those who during their earthly life never lift their souls toward heaven, and never feel a desire to penetrate the laws of creation. These, being still dominated by fleshly appetites, remain long in a troubled and semi-conscious state. There are others whose aspirations have happily flown upwards towards the eternal heights. To these, the moment of separation comes with calmness and peace. They know that progress is the law of being, and that the life to come will be better than that which they have quitted. They follow step by step that lethargy which reaches at last to the heart, and when, slowly and insensibly, the last pulsation ceases, the departed are already above the body whose falling asleep they have been watching. Freeing themselves from the magnetic bonds, they feel themselves swiftly borne by an unknown force toward the point of creation, to which their sentiments, their aspirations, and their hopes have drawn them." In this work, he presents time as fundamentally relative and non-existent for souls who are not bound by physical or planetary limitations. Quote, "Years, days, and hours are constituted by the movements of the Earth. In space, outside these movements, time does not exist. Indeed, it is impossible to have any notion of time. When Lumen describes how life is in the spiritual state between incarnations, he explains how, when his attention is focused on one planet in particular, quote, "When I reached this ringed world, I found myself clothed in a form like that of its inhabitants. It appeared that my soul had attracted to itself the constituent atoms of a new body." Lumen describes, like many near-death experiencers, the existence of far more hues of color than can be seen with physical eyes. As well, there is a supervision, which does not require any zooming in or out to behold objects in minute detail. Quote, "I saw any special thing that I fixed my sight upon, such as a town or a tract of country, with perfect clearness and distinctness." As well, Lumen emphasizes spiritual motion at the speed of thought. Quote, "Have I not already anticipated your question in telling you that I crossed this distance with the swiftness of thought?" In one place, Lumen describes coming closer to a planet with similar conditions as the Earth, and finding the incarnation of another version of himself. In Flammarion's other novel, Urania, there is a description of an incarnation on another planet where the soul of the protagonist incarnated as a woman and not a man. In Lumen, we may perceive Flammarion striking on another parallel theme to numerous near-death experience and out-of-body experience reports. As Lumen describes in the post-death state, quote, "I had no body, and yet I was not incorporeal. I felt and saw that I was constituted of a substance which, however, bore no analogy to the material form of terrestrial bodies. I know not how I traversed the celestial spaces, but by some unknown force, I soon found that I was approaching a magnificent golden sun, the splendor of which did not, however, dazzle me. I perceived that it was surrounded by a number of worlds, each enveloped in one or more rings. Anyone familiar with Robert Monroe's voluminous reports of out-of-body experiences will understand the description of an ethereal body, or as Monroe called it, the second body, which is not dissimilar to ancient Neoplatonic explanations of the ethereal form a soul begins to take on as it descends closer and closer to worldly incarnation. What is the force Flammarion insists is behind a soul being able to move across cosmic distances at the speed of thought? Nothing more than attraction. This in itself is a plausible explanation for the manifestations of visual forms of recently deceased or the dying, who can exhibit not only terminal lucidity, but an increase of psychic will brought on by terminal necessity. Suggesting attraction in this way potentially solves the mystery of what is bringing a mother's form into the dream or into the bedroom of her son right around the time of the mother's death. In all this, we have but briefly glanced at the colossal work left to posterity by the great Camille Flammarion, who died at the age of 83 in 1925. While Flammarion predicted great progress against the materialistic corrosion of collective spirituality, he largely underestimated the stubbornness of mankind and our proclivity for violence, hypocrisy, and dogmatic regression. Many of the authors of the letters making up his report attest to the low tolerance for such spiritual beliefs in popular society, writing things like, "I beg you, if you publish it, only to put my initials, for the town in which I live has a population made up of people who are frivolous, ignorant, or else bigoted hypocrites." Or, quote, "If you publish this, I beg you to change my name and the name of the town where it took place, for our people are all end of century and they mock at everything." Perhaps we might find inspiration in this profound thinker to commit ourselves to our beliefs and encourage more open-mindedness and a sharing of experiences in our families and communities. If you would like to support this channel, please find the links below in the description. If you would like to report your own paranormal or phenomenal dream experiences or death phenomena experiences, I'm currently collecting reports of modern phenomena for future projects, which you can email to me directly, with the option to remain anonymous if you wish. Thank you for liking and subscribing, and be well.